Welcome to my Research, Design, and Critique with Exceptional Human Experiences presentation. This is Gina Applebee, and I am not able to figure out the screen capture software for this, so I'll make sure that the slideshow is attached if you're dying for slides. Okay, so I chose this paper, which is called Kundalini and Transpersonal Development of a Kundalini Awakening Scale. And this is by Laura Sanchez and Michael Daniels. It's a 2008 paper in the Journal of Transpersonal Review. Journal of Transpersonal Psychology Review. There it is. Got it? Okay, and the APA reference and the details are on this slide. So it's just here on the first slide. So a little bit of background. Essentially, there's very little research in the area of Kundalini awakenings and Kundalini experiences. A lot of this experience is cloaked in a lot of historical mysticism or sort of this very pathologizing view in the West. It's often misunderstood or mislabeled as some version of psychosis or mania, sometimes depression, at least that's reported in a little bit of the literature. You know, the little bit of research that is out there focuses on some historical case studies and, you know, the excellent existing work on spiritual emergence and spiritual emergencies more generally. Now, the goal of Sanchez and Daniels was really to develop this Kundalini awakening scale, the KAS, as an effort to better characterize this experience and also to compare the frequency of different types, different groups. All right, new slide. This is just still a little more background. It's a quote from Gopi Krishna in which she goes on and on about how Kundalini is essentially the key to everything. And I included this because it demonstrates, you know, exactly how shrouded in mysticism this experience is. And also, this is part of Kundalini itself, just to have this sort of felt transrational experience of understanding everything. So here he says it's like the source of all genuine, you know, spiritual and psychic phenomena, essentially. And, you know, in the East, there is a long-standing history and on what this experience is and what it's about. And in terms of what's actually happening and giving voice to the experience itself, we don't have much. So in their brief literature review, Sanchez and Daniels did a pretty nice job of going through and looking at what's out there in a variety of sources, both spiritual and, you know, the limited stuff that's available. And so on this next slide I have, it's not a fully fleshed out framework, but something they did that was pretty interesting in terms of categorizing these experiences as relatively hot versus cool Kundalini awakenings. And they kind of begin to correlate this, the hot corresponding to somewhat unstructured Kundalini experiences, so outside a structured religious or spiritual tradition, versus cool experiences that went along with things like more traditional practices of yoga and meditation. And then they took this a step further and sort of brought it into the Washburn versus Wilbur pictures of spiritual development and said, hey, this kind of hot Kundalini, this relatively unstructured experience seems to fit with Washburn's model of spiral dynamics versus that more sort of structured, cool experience corresponding with Wilber's kind of linear hierarchical view. Okay, next slide. Where are we? So Sanchez and Daniels also explored various descriptions of Kundalini and a wide variety of sources, and then looked at what had been done in terms of trying to measure this experience. So Thalborn and Fox in 1999 came up with a kind of Kundalini scale, but the authors here are arguing that those were really focused on sort of the negative physical symptoms. So really kind of operating within that pathologizing model. Now, many of the experiences that come with the Kundalini can be perceived as very strange and very disturbing, but those aren't the only sorts of aspects of the phenomena. So in 2000, Grayson identified Kundalini as a non-pathological force with both physical and psychological symptoms. And so what Sanchez and Daniels really wanted to do was to take sources as they could and improve on the existing work by developing this Kundalini awakening scale that included both relatively positive and negative aspects of the experience, as well as physical and more subjective transpersonal aspects. All right, this next slide, we have some participants. So, they began with a group of yoga participants, and first, let's go backwards a little bit here. So let's touch on some of their hypotheses. They didn't really articulate a research question per se, but they did, really break down some hypotheses. So they thought that a group of yoga practitioners would essentially have higher scores on this Kundalini awakening scale than yoga students. They also thought that, very experienced practitioners from yoga would compare similarly with experienced folks from other spiritual traditions. And the idea here being that Kundalini underlies many different types of spiritual development. What else? Here on the slide. Yes. They also hypothesized that people having a more structured Kundalini experience would exhibit relatively positive symptoms, whereas these folks in the more unstructured category, so not following a traditional path, would have a little bit of a harder time and manifest more of what they're calling the negative symptoms. Okay, so there were two major phases to the research. The first phase was really development of this pilot Kundalini scale. And the second one was a comparison between groups. And we'll just walk through each one of those briefly. So on the next slide, we're really focused on this first phase in terms of developing the pilot KAS. And items were developed based on this huge variety of sources. So texts speaking about Kundalini, anything relevant, so Graf and Graf's work on spiritual emergencies, and the few sort of case studies that are out there. And again, the aim was to include both these physical experiences and more transpersonal aspects, as well as relatively positive and negative sort of manifestations of the experience. Next slide. And I apologize, there's a little bit of redundancy here in my slides, but you can bear with me. So, we had a total of 185 items that were selected for the initial pilot scale. And again, those pulled from all these various sources, you know, speaking to some of the more common aspects as well as the ones that were less frequently mentioned. The goal is to do sort of a really thorough picture of the Kundalini experience. So all the questions were phrased in an affirmative way, and in some scales, people like to mix it up, you know, in a positive way, and some are phrased in a negative way. But because the experience itself kind of includes both positive and negative aspects, the authors argued it would be confusing to phrase things in both a positive and negative way when that was sort of already inherent in the items. What else? Responses were recorded using a 7-point Likert scale, good old Likert. And, right, finally, here we are at participants. So, 30 people in Portugal. The scale was written both in English and then translated in Portuguese, and they did acknowledge some of those limitations of translation. Anyway, so they had 140 folks in Portugal, and they snowball sampling technique. We had, undergraduates, workers from a court of law, a bunch of people from a swimming pool. These are the non-spiritual practitioners. Workers from a primary school, and some people in a postgraduate. So, next slide here. We have the breakdown about all the participants in this development phase. We had basically 24 people who were regularly meditators, one that attended a Sunday school, 3 that practiced Reiki. We had just one yoga practitioner, and 7 that regularly engaged in some sort of introspective practice, and a variety of other folks were listed in here. So, you know, when they went through and gave all these people the pilot scale for this first phase, they found that I'm not sure how to say this properly, Cronbach's alpha for the KAS was 0.98. So they concluded that that's pretty good, and the pilot Kundalini scale is, you know, a highly reliable measure. So, moving sort of more into the phase 2, where they were looking at comparisons between groups. This is a new slide. They, you know, used the sort of revised scale. So it went down to 6 items. And they wanted to look at a couple different groups and compare between them. So we had a group of yoga students, and a group of people who were following a different spiritual path or tradition. And again, next slide, the yoga teachers and yoga students, and it has the demographic breakdown here on the slide, were selected from this school because it has a wide variety of techniques that are taught, including both the more physical, so the asana practices, and the more mental, so meditation practices. They, really sought to select yoga students that had not been practicing so long. The relationship between the period of practice and the scores on the KAS. And next slide. Uh-oh. There we go. Lost my slide place. Patience is a virtue that we are all cultivating. Got it. Okay. So what have we here? There's a little bit more breakdown of the demographics. So they really wanted to, as best they could, match from the yoga group with this group that came from another spiritual path. And for that second group, they went to a sort of transpersonal psychology collective. And, these folks practiced a variety of techniques. Most of them were experienced meditators, and a few others had different techniques. Let's see. Yeah, a few more details listed on the slide here. So, in terms of what they found after administrating the KAS to all these groups, was that, let's go one more slide here. Right, so the total scores on the KAS were, on the whole, much higher for the yoga teachers than the yoga students, and that was a significant difference. They also found that, let's see, the effect size, proportional variance, blah, blah, blah. The main sort of interesting correlation here was between the high scores on the KAS and the length of time of spiritual practice, whether that was practice in yoga or practice from one of these other spiritual paths. And they checked to make sure age wasn't a factor, and the age was not a significant factor. So it was just the time, the extent of practice that was really correlated with the high score on the KAS. And all the numbers here are listed. So next slide. It looks like there was also correlation. Again, this is just reiterating the extent of practice and the scores on the KAS. They sort of postulated that this indicates in a sort of path of development. So moving along here to the next slide, where the time on a spiritual path sort of leads to increased signs or symptoms of Kundalini. Now, there was no significant interaction between the scores and the participants' age. I've mentioned that. Yeah, and so they're, and they were very, I'll go back and review this a little bit, but they were sort of very muddled in terms of presenting their methods and their results and their conclusions based on those results in a way that was separate. It was all kind of tangled up in there in a way that was a little bit muddy. So based on this sort of major correlation that they found, right, they're thinking supportive of an idea that we have this developmental path where Kundalini awakenings are caused or facilitated by extended periods of practice throughout this process. I did say that it's possible that people who are more dedicated to their various paths are just more likely to have a Kundalini experience. All right, so next slide. Unfortunately, it gets to this point in the PDF document of the paper, and it's just cut off. So it's a preprint version of the paper, and I searched and searched to see if perhaps there's a more complete version that's out there. Because there really wasn't anything in terms of a thorough, presentation of results, a thorough discussion and conclusion. They did have a few tables to show sort of the statistics of what they did, and those are not included in the slides here because I don't know how to screen capture it as a blind person. But I'll certainly attach the paper so you can take a look at it yourself. So, at least in terms of the version that I have, there's very little way in the way of a thorough discussion in relating what they found to the existing literature. They also did not kind of go back and say, here are hypotheses that we had initially, and here's what we could say about these hypotheses now. There was also not much in terms of an earth-shattering conclusion. Not that you could do much with a pilot scale like this. They could have done a lot better job of discussing the limitations of their study and, some future directions. So, I will say that in phase 1, in the development of the pilot KAS, it seems like they did a pretty okay job. So it was an okay start. They did talk about how they were trying to build there on the work of Thalborn and Fox and a few others in terms of developing a better measure. So phase 1, I think, is okay. But in phase 2, they did not talk at all about future directions. And in an area like this where there's so little research that's been done, of course, there are a ton of possibilities in terms of new directions and areas of exploration that need to be addressed. Personally, as somebody who's really interested in these phenomena, I think there needs to be much more sort of qualitative research done on both the structured and unstructured experiences, whether that falls into a framework like they describe with sort of hot, versus cool, or relatively sort of Washburn style spiral dynamic versus hierarchical spiritual development remains to be seen. I think there needs to be a lot of good qualitative research there. Also, I think a priority in terms of future directions is development of, really rigorous measures and scales that are grounded in that qualitative research, and also beginning to investigate, how to better identify and characterize these experiences, and also areas where folks who may be having these experiences struggle the most, and how they could be best supported. So overall, it's an interesting topic. I really dig it. But there is just not a lot of good research out there. And, especially when I got to the point of this paper where I realized they didn't have anything really in the way of a quality presentation of results and discussions and conclusion. It was like, gosh, we really need to do a better job with this area of research. Yeah, and that's all I've got. I'll make sure and attach the PDFs with the slides such as they are, and a copy of the paper as well. Thanks for listening.